I'm Todd Jones, recovering from 30 years as a sports writer. Thanks for joining me as I sit down with some of the best sports writers of our time, who knew the greatest athletes and coaches and experienced firsthand some of the biggest sports moments of the past half century. We'll share stories behind the stories, some we've only told each other. Pull up a seat on Press Box Access. I've always had a lot of respect for Christine Brennan because she's never been afraid to take a stand on an issue in sports. Locally, nationally, internationally. She reports it, writes it, says it, stands by it. Christine has done so for 4 decades, and she's still doing it as a sports columnist for USA Today and a commentator for ABC News, PBS NewsHour, and National Public Radio. Today, she's our guest on Press Box Access. Talk about fearless. Well, Christine, thanks a lot for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Todd, it's great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I want to start off with a congratulations to you. The 2020, the Associated Press Sports Editors named you the Red Smith Award winner. Quite an honor. Quite an honor. How did that make you feel?
Oh my gosh! Well, I think it means that I'm old. I think Todd is. It's you got to be around a while to get that one. No, it was. I wasn't expecting it at all, and it was actually right before everything changed. It was March, early March, and I was flying back to D.C. and I had an email to get in touch with someone from APSE who I would normally not hear from, and I thought, what's that about? So it was in baggage claim at Washington National Airport, DCA. As I was waiting for my luggage from a trip, I'd just been down to Florida. I think it was March 2nd that I got the message and then found out that I had won this prestigious award. And so many great names from sports journalism, as you know,
right.
Including my boss at the Washington Post, George Solomon, and a lovely honor, just almost overwhelming.
Your career has been quite the career. You were a trailblazer for women sports writers in so many ways. Covered 18 straight Olympics. I think about all those times that you were like the first person to do something, for a female sports writer. When you think about the summation of your career, how do you put it all together?
I just was doing what I loved, and I'm still doing what I love, and I was able to be launched out of Northwestern University, my alma mater, and just got very fortunate to go right to the Miami Herald at a time when the Herald still had not hired a full-time woman sports writer. And you remember, those times. I'm sure some of your listeners do too. Go right out of college to this top 10 newspaper, Miami Herald, and I covered the Florida Gators football team in 81 and 82. So I had this major beat right away.
Right.
And this was when Miami didn't have the NBA or Major League Baseball or hockey. It was just football. So the Dolphins and then the colleges. And so it was a big deal. But this happened because I was a woman. And I'm going to be perfectly honest. If I'd been a white man, I would not have gotten that job. Billie Jean King says it best, you need to see it to be it. And here I was, I had an opportunity as 22 to be a role model for young women, and the Miami Herald gave me that opportunity, and I wanted to make the most of it, including doing interviews about being the first woman, even though for me it was like, hey, I just want to write a story today. I just want to go out and cover, cover a Dolphins practice and talk to Don Shula, one of my heroes, who's now, someone I'm covering. And yet I also knew that there would be people watching and probably hoping that I would fail.
When you think about all the different things you covered, I think if there's one story that just jumps out in your career, it's a story that really just continues to live in the history of Olympics, but in American sports. Nancy Kerrigan and Tonya Harding.
The most amazing story I've ever covered, Todd. You describe a little bit of it and people now will go, yeah, that was a big deal. No, I mean, that story took over the nation and in many ways the world for 6 or 7 weeks. And it just had this incredible drumbeat and momentum going. And it started January 6, 1994. With the attack on Nancy Kerrigan's knee.
Where were you at the time when she was struck by what later we've learned was a baton by somebody we didn't know who this was? This person shows up and hits her in the leg. Nancy Kerrigan, the great figure skater at the U.S. Championships. Where were you at the time, and were you in the arena?
I was in the other arena next door, Joe Louis, at which, of course, as you know, they are connected. And Cobo Arena was the practice arena, and that's where the women were practicing. Normally, I would be watching the women practice, but in this case, the pair's short program was going on. So I was sitting in a relatively empty Joe Louis arena. Obviously, some fans were there, but in press seating, in just in one of the sections, with a group of Olympic writers, and including Randy Harvey of the LA Times, Phil Hirsch of the Chicago Tribune, and a few others. And someone came by and said that Nancy Kerrigan had been mugged. Now, as only this could be in figure skating, right? You're kind of like, what? But meanwhile, there's a pair out there skating.
Right.
Music is playing, and it's this, it's figure skating at its finest, and kind of, whatever it is, whimsical, kind of interesting, bizarre sport. And so this pair is skating, and so none of us get up because we're just kind of, what was that? But we're watching this pair skate. So the moment the music ends, none of us spoke to each other, about 5 or 6 of us Olympic writers. The music ends, and immediately all 5 or 6 of us just shoot up, stand up, and without saying a word, just file into the aisle and go down in an elevator to the press room in Joe Louis. And I looked at the press chief, the spokesperson, the chief PR person for U.S. figure skating, a woman named Kristen Matta. I looked at her. She was sitting at a table, and I just looked at her. And I can't, I know that obviously people listening can't see it, but I kind of did that shrug, like put my hands out like, huh? Kind of this look. And she had this pronounced nod of her head, like, yes. So without saying a word, I had said, like, could this be true? Without her even knowing what I'm asking. She's nodding yes. And we were off and running on the wildest, craziest, and most amazing story I have ever and will ever see in my journalistic career.
No, I want to carry this through because it did go on for weeks, because this was leading up to the Olympics. Really, it was every day in January and February. I was not there. I was covering college basketball at the time in Cincinnati. And I got to be honest, like, my idea of figure skating at the time in my career, I thought, I just kind of thought it was a joke. I remember once writing a column, the very lazy thing where you just rip the sport. And to tweak my mother, I cut it out and I mailed it to her, because my mother, my late mother, she worshipped figure skating. Like, Dick Button was a saint in our house. So I send her this column, and a couple of days later, she writes back to me and says, or she didn't write back. She called me and she said, "You're an asshole."
That's your mom.
But what I realized, though, is that I thought it was crazy, but it meant a lot to a lot of people. And why do you think that story just caught on like brush fire?
At the time, Todd, by the way, you were not alone among a big segment of our population, probably mostly like guys, who were thinking, skating, okay. I mean, Peggy Fleming, yeah. Dorothy Hamill, sure. Every boy wanted to date her and every girl wanted to be her. But it turns out at the time, figure skating was the second most popular sport on television to the National Football League in terms of ratings. Your listeners are going to just keel over at this, but this is a fact. It is true. In 1996, so 2 years after Tonya and Nancy, the World Championship, Figure Skating World Championships in Edmonton, and the men's long program, the men's final at the World Championships, went head-to-head with the NCAA men's basketball tournament. I think it was the Sweet 16. And figure skating beat it head-to-head in TV ratings. And it wasn't a minuscule decimal point. It was like 2 or 3 points. It was like a 9-something to like a 7-something in ratings.
Well, I know my mother was watching.
But you know what it was? It was women's football. Women took the remote control and said, honey, sit down and watch or leave the room. I'm in charge. I think it was an eye-opener, not just, with you and your mom, but you knew that the Olympics, it was huge TV ratings. It was must-see TV. So literally, I'm on the front page of the Washington Post almost every day with this story. I mean, who would have thought that? You remember, it's the lead story on NBC, ABC, CBS every night. It was the first reality TV story, frankly.
That's a great point.
That's what Yeah. This is about 4 months, right? 5 months before O.J. Simpson
trial, right.
And 2 dead bodies. And this was about a bruised knee that spurred Nancy Kerrigan on to the greatest performance of her life. She recovered. She was okay. So it's the most famous bruised knee in history.
Well, again, it just transcended sports. It became like that's a great point that you made about the O.J. trial. The murders happened a few months later That trial obviously took on a life of its own. I heard OJ played football.
Me too, yeah.
But what I'm saying is it became like sports and culture. It just all meshed together. That was something about the time that we were living in 1994 that just brought something like this to life. And really kind of like it changed your career, right? I mean, you went on from there, to write The Inside Edge, a book that Sports Illustrated has said is one of the top 100 sports books of all time, and that led you to the job you have had since at the USA Today with being a columnist. So, really, Nancy and Tonya played a part in your career. Is that right?
Absolutely. You will not find many serious journalists who would say this, but I will. Tonya Harding changed my life. Obviously, again, I'm not making fun of someone attacking someone, clearly. But again, because Nancy Kerrigan survived, thrived, and is great to this day. I think what it was for me was, and I tell young journalists all the time, you just never know what story it's going to be. You probably feel this way, Todd, about your career, but you never know. I mean, who would have thought that it would be a figure skating story that would then, I would be able to write Inside Edge, which became a bestseller, and then get another book deal, which then reflected the success of that.
Before we leave that topic, give me your best Nancy Tonya story.
Well, I think when I think about the craziness at the Olympic Games, and it was nuts. It really, the whole story, everything that was happening, it was just this crescendo building, and it all just drops into the beautiful, pristine countryside of snow-covered Norway. And there was a lot happening. I mean, any hiccup, any sneeze, and it was major news. Tonya, Nancy, you couldn't get enough of it. And I remember a dear friend, in fact, the spokesperson for the U.S. Olympic Committee at the time, I think you knew him as well, passed away last year, Mike Moran. And Mike was in the center of this hurricane constantly. And they had this press conference about 2 a.m. in Norway. It was the day of the opening ceremonies. We'd already covered the opening ceremonies, frozen. It was brutally cold, writing story after story. And now 2 o'clock, they're going to have this press conference in the morning. And they're announcing Tonya Harding is going to be coming to the Olympics. And with that, all the U.S. Olympic Committee executives and officials leave the room as we have nothing but questions of how this is going to happen.
They're gone.
And poor Mike Moran is standing there, and there's a picture that actually a dear friend of his sent me after he passed away. Mike in the eye of this hurricane, and you can see the back of my head. You can see all, there's probably 150 journalists all gathered around, and Mike looks like literally the eye of the hurricane. And I remember asking Mike, I was kind of on his back shoulder, back right shoulder. I remember asking Mike this question as he's just getting peppered with questions, including are they going to live together? Because there was like an apartment.
Oh, wow.
Yes, they were. And so I asked the key journalistic question, Todd, are they going to be brushing their teeth next to one another?
What was the answer?
And Mike Moran, who was a good friend then, obviously, and a colleague, of course, and someone I quoted a lot, and became an even better friend. He turns slowly, like slow motion, and he gives me this look I will never forget, this glare. He says not a word, which is one of the first and only times Mike Moran didn't have something to say. He glares at me, and he just turns his head back, and he goes, next question. But I think they might have been brushing their teeth next to one another, which again, when you consider that one, the ex-husband and others of the one attacked the other, and Tonya admitted knowing about it, actually I thought it was a good question, but Mike Moran was having none of it.
No part of that. No part of that.
No.
Well, we talked so much figure skating, and you were not a figure skater, but growing up, you played a lot of sports, though, right? And growing up in Toledo, Ohio. Tell me a little bit about sports in your youth and how you even got into sports writing.
So I was tall and athletic and wanted to play sports. And back then, a lot of parents told their daughters no.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they really did.
In the 60s, girls didn't play sports, right?
No way. No way. And my mom and dad said yes. And I couldn't wait till my dad would get home, and I'd throw the baseball with him and play catch. And he got me a mitt. And most girls wanted dolls when they turned, 8. And I had some dolls, but I wanted a baseball mitt. My dad and mom just went out and got it for me. And I never, the term "throw like a girl" is so ridiculous because, of course, now we're teaching millions of girls, generations of girls, to throw the ball properly. So I guess it's a compliment. But back in the day, it wasn't a compliment. It was that pushing motion. But I never threw like a girl. My dad taught me how to cock my arm and go behind my ear and throw the ball. So that was how lucky was I to have these parents who were so comfortable in their skin that they
encouraged
felt that,
you, right?
You know, that they didn't mind if what were the neighbors saying about what's going on in the Brennan household. Who cares? My dad went out and got a bat, invited all the kids over, and we had baseball
That's
games
awesome.
every weekend, and boys and girls. And so that really was my background, which then led to being a six-sport athlete at Ottawa Hills High School. Not because I was such a great athlete, but back then girls didn't specialize, but mostly basketball and softball, tennis, field hockey. You know, those were some of my big ones in high school.
It's one thing to play sports, and even then that was revolutionary for women to be playing sports at a young age. But to play it, but to write about it, I think one time you told me that you used to listen to the Tigers radio games and write about the games when you were a kid. Is that right?
That is true. Even not even the major league level, the Toledo Mud Hens, the AAA team, of course, for the Tigers, as you know. And we had season tickets for the Mud Hens. My dad was the Pied Piper with season tickets with Michigan football, and we looked north in Toledo. Obviously, we were right there on the line. And as Michigan games and Tigers, but Toledo Mud Hens were huge for us. And so I listened to an entire season of Toledo Mud Hens games on the radio, keeping score and writing up little stories. And I was like 10 years old. And I dare say not only was no girl in America doing that in the late 60s, probably very few boys were doing that. So that's how into this I was. And I remember my dad walking through the living room once, and that's where I had the radio for and I was probably writing some little story up on just a notebook paper. And he kind of looked, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, I'm just, writing up about, Hens just scored a couple runs, and I'm writing that." Even he was kind of, my biggest supporter was kind of like, "Okay, sure."
Yeah, well, I got to admit, I had that same response from my own parents. I used to play this game, APBA. It was a dice game, baseball.
Oh, yeah.
And you had these cards, and you'd play the 75 Reds would play the 61 Yankees. And I had a notebook, and I would write game summaries after every game, and I kept stats, and I made trades to help the Reds, But I would write these little summaries, and my parents would walk by and like, "Oh, this geek."
Well, and by the way, the Reds didn't need much help in 75 and 76. Yeah, even though we were up north, absolutely, I would get those games on the radio, which was really cool.
So sports is such a big part of your life growing up. Writing, you go to Northwestern, you get your master's there, great journalism school, obviously. And then you go to the Miami Herald in 1981, as you mentioned, as the first full-time female sports writer. But you had interned there the year before, right, in Miami, I think? And
that's right. Yeah, I'd interned. And kids, anyone's listening, parents of kids, internships are the key. I'm sure you agree, Todd. Grades are great, and I'm all for getting all A's and the pride you have in that. But boy, oh boy, it's so important, those internships. And I was lucky. I had 4 internships while I was at Northwestern, 2 at the Toledo Blade, my hometown paper. And the first one, Todd, was a city desk, writing obits and things like that, covering county fairs. But I kept wandering back to the sports section. I just thought this would be so cool to be a sports writer. So next summer was sports, and that was the U.S. Open, was at Inverness. Hale Irwin won that one. I was an intern covering that. And every time I think about covering golf now, I've been so lucky to cover a lot of the Masters, the U.S. Opens, et cetera. And I think about being that, probably a 20-year-old a student just wandering through the press room, looking at all the names, Tom Boswell and Dan Jenkins, the nameplates. And it does make me smile because, of course, I knew Dan so well and know Tom well. And now, of course, those nameplates at those tournaments, I'm now covering them, and I'm in one of those.
Now
seats.
you're the nameplate.
it's pretty cool. It's I never lose sight of how fortunate I am.
But as an intern in 1980, the Herald sent you to an NFL locker room, right? You went to the Vikings, Dolphins preseason game, and so they send you in there to an NFL locker room. You're probably, 20 years old. What was that? What was that like in 1980 for you to all of a sudden be challenging the status quo?
It was. I was an intern. I was in between undergrad and master's at Northwestern, and so the sports editor of the Miami Herald, Paul Anger, who was instrumental in so much of the opportunities I had and whatever success I've been able to achieve. Paul pulled me aside a few days before. These were exhibition games. So this is the old Orange Bowl, and it's the Miami Dolphins against the Minnesota Vikings, as you said. And I'm going to do a feature on, just a sidebar, on the Vikings after this preseason game. So I'm part of the Miami Herald's team covering that game. There's probably 6, 7, 8 of us. Like Larry Dorman was on the beat at the time covering the Dolphins. And anyway, so Paul pulls me in and says, we're gonna send you to, you're gonna do a Viking sidebar, which means you're gonna go in the locker room. We've talked to the Vikings people. They know you're coming in there. They've never had a woman in the locker room before, but they are going to let you in. And, there was something about it. I was like, I'm ready for this. So
I'm Bruce Martin, host of Pit Pass Indy. Each week, I go behind the scenes of the NTT IndyCar Series and introduce our listeners to the biggest stars of IndyCar, which features the Indianapolis 500 as its cornerstone event. The men and women that compete in IndyCar may be the bravest athletes in all of sport, as danger lurks around every corner. They are able to look danger in the eye without flinching. That is why the NTT IndyCar Series features the best racing on the planet. Join me every week as we talk to the stars of IndyCar, including the legends of the Indianapolis 500 on Pit Pass Indy from Evergreen Podcast.
Game's over, and in I go into that door at the Orange Bowl, which I ended up being in many times after that. And I walk in, and first is the coach, as you know, Todd. Well, it's the coach, and so that's Bud Grant. I mean, my goodness, the legendary Bud Grant. And yes,
chiseled out of rock. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm 22 years old, and all those Super Bowls that he coached in. I mean, I've watched every football game on television, and I could recite everything about Bud Grant.
So what did Bud think when you walked up?
So he was, he had been told as well. Obviously, I got to give credit to Paul at the Miami Herald for making sure that the word got out so that they at least knew about it. Although what was to come was kind of interesting, but there's a few of us asking questions, and so I'm just with a group. But gradually they all peel off, and I have a question specifically to ask him, a couple questions. We all have done that occasionally. And I also, by the way, I was wearing a skirt, very, probably below my knee. I was like conservatively dressed, but I thought I want to make it clear that if anyone's even just glancing around, there's a woman in here. I had such respect for the fact that I was doing this and for their privacy, the players, and the understanding that this is the workplace, and it's a strange workplace, but it is the workplace for reporters. So that's why you have equal access to it. Anyway, and so I looked at Bud Grant, and he goes, "You're going in there." And I said, "I am." Now, there are coaches, as you know, around that time who would stop women. There were many who were not at all understanding of the idea of equal access and equality for women. So that was not a good time for a lot.
Yeah, and it went on all through the 1980s. I mean,
Sure,
so.
even, you could probably find a college coach right now who doesn't believe a woman should be in the locker room, which, again, shame on them. Thankfully, the laws and the rules have changed, and the commissioners made the decisions and what have you. But Bud Grant, to his great credit, said, "All right, there you go. How about that? How about that? This is a guy born in, I think Bud Grant was born in the 20s, probably.
Probably 1620.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, in I go. And I would love to have a camera video of me and my face and just what I was doing. I'm sure I was fine, but inside my heart was, starting to race a little bit, because what I walked into, there were players in all kinds of stages of undress. There were some players still in uniform. There were some who were naked or wearing towels, and everything in between. Now, my goal, and I knew this, was to just beeline to a few lockers and get a couple quotes and get out of there. And of course, the idea, I'm sure it's hard, I can't believe we still have to talk about this, but for those listening who think this is somehow exciting or sexy, it's the complete antithesis of that, as you know, Todd. And if you were in a woman's locker room, you'd feel the exact same way. You've got a job to do. You're going to get these quotes and get out of there. But for a preseason game, they take, there's no names above the lockers.
Right, so you don't know who's who.
And right, so I got my flip card because I knew I needed to be prepared. I've never prepared my whole life for these moments. And so I've got the names and the numbers. So if I need to find out where he is, Tommy Kramer, I would know who he was. He was the quarterback at the time. But you've got, number 88. Okay, there he is. And I can quickly look if I need, there's 4 or 5 guys I wanted to talk to. Well, they're now starting to take off their jerseys. So now you don't have numbers, and you don't have any numbers above the lockers like you normally would in a regular season. And I'm stuck because I cannot look around. I cannot. My eyes cannot wander. I knew this. I knew all this at 22. So out of the blue, as I'm standing there, walks up this player, and it is Tom Hannon, a safety for the Vikings. And he looks at me, and he says, "Who do you need?" How about that? Who do you need?
There's always guys that will be helpful, right?
Well, and this is extraordinary. That I'm the first woman to ever be in the Vikings locker room. It's my first time ever being in a men's locker room. And I said a couple names, and I then noticed Tommy Kramer was still there, and I could see him. And then I said, "And you," because he had 2 interceptions that day, and I wanted to interview him. So I talked to him, and then I walked over to Kramer, talked to him. Fine, totally fine. There was one other player I needed to speak with, and he, unfortunately, Todd, wanted to stand there buck naked. And so he walks up to me, and I walk up to him. I mean, we both kind of, walk towards each other because I think he sensed that I wanted to talk to him, and he just had to be naked. Now, the good news is that I, just by chance, carried an 8x11 notebook that day. And I learned very quickly that an 8x11 notebook, especially when with heels, I'm probably 6'1", that 8x11.5 notebook was perfectly positioned. And got the interview and got out of there. I will also say that before this, I went up, I went in the locker room. I actually called back home. I got my mom and dad, of course, like I'm sure many of us.
I was wondering what your dad was thinking.
Mom's on one line, dad's on the other. And I told them I was going to be going into the men's locker room for the first time. And I said, "Dad, do you have any advice for me?" And he said, "Honey, keep eye contact at all times."
Father knows best.
That's right. So that's been that's exactly what I did. Saw the whites of their eyes.
Well, from there, football became your life throughout the 80s. I mean, you covered the Miami Hurricanes for the Herald, the great Howard Schnellenberger. I always think of Howard with his pipe. He always looked like he was teaching a philosophy class, like he's going to tell you about Socrates or something. But exactly. You covered that great 84 Orange Bowl when the Hurricanes upset Nebraska.
What a team that was. And Miami was an incredible underdog. But that, by the way, that experience covering the Hurricanes in 83, I'm out there watching practice and the actually spring before, that fall season. And Jim Kelly was still there, working out. He'd had a shoulder injury, separation and surgery, but he was getting back in shape and for pro scouts. So he's throwing passes right on the same sideline as a couple other quarterbacks are throwing passes. And I'm looking at these guys going, my God, they all look fantastic. And then I'm saying to myself, even though, again, I'm a relatively new reporter, I know football so well from going to all kinds of, season tickets at Michigan, season tickets at University of Toledo, watching every college and pro game. I'm thinking these guys look really good. Like, this is only one campus in the country. How is it possible? Well, in addition to Jim Kelly, the other 2 guys were Bernie Kosar and Vinny Testaverde.
Amazing.
So lucky me covering that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one team. Now, Kelly then graduated, and then Testaverde and Kosar, of course, were freshmen, and Howard Schnellenberger made the choice. There was a third guy as well, Al Van de Wendy, that they were deciding between. But Schnellenberger picks Kosar. They lose their first game to Florida, and then, of course, they never lose again. Yeah. And, as a young journalist, I'm covering every second of that. I'm the only outsider probably of any kind that was around that team every single day.
What a great ride.
What a wonderful, amazing experience. Yeah.
And that really kind of took you up to the Washington Post, right? The Post reaches out, hires you, and then it's more football. You become the first woman to cover what was then the Washington Redskins, what we now know, rightfully so, as the Washington National Football Team. 1985, now you're on the NFL beat. The great Joe Gibbs was the coach. He had players like Joe Theismann, Dexter Manley, Dave Butts, So how were you received and treated on a day-to-day basis as a woman covering that NFL team?
I can't say enough, Todd, about Joe Gibbs and what a class act he was and is. We stayed in touch. And, here he is. He is told that, first of all, we know they don't love any beat writer, right? I mean, that's the essence of the job.
Yeah, you're doing your job if they don't
job,
like you, right?
Yeah, if I'm doing my job properly and they're doing their job properly, they're not going to like me. You don't go in, by the way, wanting to be disliked, but my role is to serve the readers of the Washington Post. It's not to serve Joe Gibbs or any of his players or the owner or anyone. So we're now in 1985. It was still piecemeal prior to 85 in terms of locker room. So I could go to the Miami Dolphins or cover them when I was down in Miami, and Don Shula, well ahead of his time. What a wonderful, wonderful human being, a terrific class act, just one of the greats of all time. He issued robes for his players back in 1982 and said, put on the robes. And
yeah, it's not that difficult.
Women reporters.
Yeah, be a pro.
In this case, it was mostly me, and there was another woman in Daytona Beach. They're going to be in there, and that was the end of the story. Other teams hadn't figured it out yet,
right?
Or were I don't know, dragging their feet. Back then, this was the norm, and so Gibbs did not believe women should be in the locker room. He's a very religious guy, and he didn't think women should be in the locker room. At the same time, he's being asked about all this. George Solomon and other sports editors are going up to meet Pete Rozelle, then the commissioner of the National Football League, and saying, hey, time has come. This is, again, is summer of 85. The Washington Post is going to put a woman on the beat. This is the most important beat in Washington, obviously the football team. So the time has come. And whether it was because specifically of me or not, I don't care. I don't think, no one's ever said, and I don't need it to be. But this accumulated point, we've reached a critical mass here. And Pete Rozelle issues an edict. All locker rooms have to have equal access for male and female reporters. Done. You cannot keep women out by the loading dock smelling the bus fumes, which happen to be a lot. So Gibbs does an interview. I'm up in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, so I'm not seeing the interviews back in D.C., but friends are all over my voicemail, Todd, saying Gibbs was just on with Glenn Brenner, late Glenn Brenner, here, a sportscaster in D.C., and he went on and on. He doesn't believe women should be in the locker room. I don't think she'd be in the locker room. I don't think she should be in. So that's what I heard from these friends of mine. Well, then when I got home and actually saw the tape, there was a second part to Gibbs's comment. And even though he personally did not believe that a woman should be in the locker room, he had been told by Commissioner Pete Rozelle that I would be allowed in the locker room. So that is that. She will be allowed in the locker room.
Wow.
End of story. That's all you can ask for. And Gibbs and I had a terrific relationship. He's one of these guys that never went off the record ever.
Really?
So
he just always, he was on the record at all times?
Always on the record. He would, if he was mad about something, he'd call my home landline, of course, back then. Is all we had. I'd get a call at 6:30 in the morning, and he'd be, wake me up probably, and that's fine. And he'd be mad about a headline often. And I'd say, Coach, as I've told you before, I don't write the headlines. And he would then kind of laugh, and he'd go, okay, well, bring that guy who writes the headlines out with you today. And I said, well, I'd love to bring them all out because it doesn't make my job easy.
But did he ever hold a grudge? That's the key, right?
No.
They can get mad at you and you can talk it out, but it's the ones who didn't hold a grudge that you had more respect for because they know that you're doing a job and you know they're doing a job, and you go about your business. This
is what Gibbs would do. He would, there was one time I wrote, we weren't supposed to write about plays except for some of their fun stuff they do at the end of the practice. And then you could write a little feature on something or a little item. Well, I thought they were practicing some crazy flea flicker where a running back almost ran into a brick wall because they ran out of room on the practice field. And I wrote that up because that looked to me like fun end of practice stuff. Mm-hmm. Well, the next day I get a call from Gibbs, and he's not mad about the headline writers. He's mad at me. He goes, you wrote about one of our plays. And I said, what? And he goes, we'll talk about it when you're coming out today. And I said, because obviously I came out to the park every day. So he goes, we'll talk about it more then. And I'm just feeling like, oh my gosh, I thought that was a joke. I didn't realize that was part of the, I thought there was this gray area of what it was. I didn't think there was any gray area at all. Right. I thought it was just a trick, fun thing that they were doing. So now I'm out at the park. Gibbs calls me into his office. Feels like going to the principal's office a little bit. And He said, that was a play we were going to use this week against Philadelphia. And now we can't use it because of you writing about it. Well, I'm 26, 7 years old. Again, I'm not emotional, but I'm like, oh my gosh, Coach, I am so sorry. I hope you understand. I thought that was like goofing around stuff. And when Gary Clark or whoever, Ricky Sanders, almost ran into the wall, I actually thought that was, everyone was laughing. I thought it was kind of funny. He goes, I see what you're getting at. He goes, to me, though, that was a mistake. And I said, I see where you are on this too. And he looked at me, do you have anything else to say about it? I said, no, I've given you my best, explanation. And he said, you know where I'm coming from? I said, absolutely, coach. And he said, good. Now we'll move on.
That's great.
And he did that every single time.
Wow. So I always enjoyed covering the players. I always thought they felt grounded and they had a sense of perspective that other pro athletes, I don't know if it's because they were on campus for 4 years. It was such a violent game. Their careers could end at any play. They just, for the most part, in general, NFL players were good to deal with. How did they treat you in Washington?
Yeah, they were really good. Some guys got mad because you wrote a story that talked about, that they, missed 5 tackles or gave up, 3 touchdowns or something, or fumbled on the goal line, of course. But that comes with the territory. But I mean, these guys are some of the greatest football players ever. And those offensive linemen especially were terrific to deal with. You respect people. I respected Dave Butts. He had every right to not want a woman in that locker room. He respected me enough to come in on his day off to do an interview with me. And I have incredible warm memories of that time.
We talked a lot of football, but really your career has been about the Olympics. Are there lessons that you learned as a beat reporter covering the world of football that you expanded out into the great world of international sports competition?
I learned that I had to stick up for myself. I learned that I had to be strong. I learned that I had to be honest, that, I would report something and I had to then face the music the next day when someone would be furious with me.
But you learned about standing up for yourself. You learned about the idea that you take a stand, and then you become the columnist at USA Today in '97, and you're covering every Olympics since '84. And now you're talking about world issues, not just football. You're talking about world issues, world sports. And when you think about your career, the Olympics really has a special place, I would assume.
Oh my gosh, it does. As I mentioned earlier about being a girl growing up in Toledo and loving the Olympics, and I would have hoped, Todd, to go to one Olympics as a fan. As maybe maybe someday I could have tickets to an Olympic Games, and instead, 18 in a row, winter and summer, every single one since LA in '84, and not just of course for the newspapers, but also doing the TV work. Including ABC News. And of course, ABC was the network broadcasting those Olympics as a girl as I watched it. I mean, I
Jim McKay, yeah.
burst into tears at the thought of, of how full circle this is. And as well as, of course, CNN now. So it's just amazing to me. And I never lose sight of it. And you know what it is? It goes back to the reporting, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, and being that tough reporter. I mean, sports is life. It is the toy department. We used to hear those stories all the time, but it's now a part of our culture. It's no longer a mirror. It's no longer an escape from our reality. It is a mirror of our reality. And my goodness, my whole career, so much of what I do now is that intersection of sports and culture, which is now like a 12-lane superhighway. But it still starts with the reporting, and it starts with treating people right and asking questions. And I might not always ask the right questions, but I'm willing to work hard enough to get those answers and to be able to hopefully break news as I have been able to do, and also to treat people right. I just yesterday I was working on something involving the Olympics and Tokyo, and I was talking to a couple sources, and I said it's a two-way street here. You've answered my call. If there's something you don't like, if it's on the record, then
what do you got
paper.
Here? Right.
Yeah, I mean, please, you call me. And you can tell me anything. And if you see something the minute it's online, obviously now it's online. So the old days of waiting till it hits your doorstep, I want to hear about it right now. I because those relationships that I learned from covering Don Shula with the Miami Herald and Howard Schnellenberger and Charlie Pell with the Florida Gators, and then all the way to Joe Gibbs and everything in Washington, those relationships are everything. And that's what journalism is. And frankly, that's what the attack on journalism, that's what has been so unfortunate about this enemy of the people thing. We are not the enemies. We work with you, whether someone's covering the school board about your kid. That journalist is going to do the job for you. And for me, if you love sports or if you care about these issues, I'm one of many sports journalists who's out there doing this. We work with you. We work with coaches. We work with players. We're not the enemy. And thankfully, I've learned those lessons early on. And I hope to this. Well, I promise you this, Todd. I'll never forget them.
Well, I've always had a lot of respect for your willingness to take a stand, even if it might not be popular. And it all starts with the reporting. You make the calls, you do the research, you form an opinion, and then you stand by it. And I think that's not always done. And I think that the wide array of experiences in your career have led you to the point where you become such a respected voice that you end up winning the Red Smith Awards. So it's great. I have one final question. Is there any Olympic story besides Nancy and Tonya that still stands above others for you?
88 Olympics in Seoul. It's the middle, of course, the time difference is such, right, that I literally looked at Kornheiser, who I worked with at the Post at the time, Tony Kornheiser, and we're going to have lunch. I said, no, I'm going to go over to the diving venue and, just watch the preliminaries. You never know if someone's going to hit their head.
Greg Louganis, right, yeah.
Right. So, but I said that. I literally said that to Kornheiser. I never know if someone's going to hit their head. So I get some popcorn. I take one of the shuttles and I buy some popcorn at the concession stand of the diving venue. And I wander in up a stairwell, and Greg Louganis is the greatest diver who's ever lived, the greatest ever. And he's on the board at the 3-meter springboard. At that exact moment, I come in, and so I'm quiet, and I'm literally at the same level he is, and I'm probably only 20 feet from him. I'm just at this edge of the stands, and there's the boards right there. And I can see this, I have this great view of him, and up he goes, and I've covered Greg all the way through the LA games in 84. And, this is going to be his swan song in 88. And up he goes, and my brain's looking at it. I can see it. I mean, I'm right at it, and I didn't really jump out far enough. And then my other side of my brain saying, it's Greg Louganis. Don't worry.
He knows what he's doing.
Yeah, exactly. He's the best ever. But he's too close, but it's Greg Louganis too close. Boom. And he hits his head and I thought I just watched someone die. And I just remember going, oh my gosh. And he goes crumbles into the water. Thankfully, there's no blood. He appears from the surface, and he's up now, and he's rubbing his head, and people rush over and help him out of the pool. And those 30 minutes were one of the most amazing sports dramas ever. We now know he's not dead. We don't know how seriously he's injured. And we know this, that if he does not come back and do a few more preliminary dives, this is a qualifying round, he will fall like a rock through the standings, and he will not qualify. I think it was 12 that qualified. He will not be in the finals to win an Olympic gold medal, to defend his Olympic gold medal. So this, on so many levels, this is a story that is amazing. It's the middle of the night in the United States. So what's fascinating is he does come back, one of the more heroic things I've seen in sports, with a patch on his head. 30 minutes later, he's not retiring. He's not giving up. He's coming back on the board. He has to do almost the exact same dive back into the board. We all held our breath. I remember feeling we're on the pool deck, actually looking up now at him, because that's where the press kind of was to be there, and the press section. And looking up, I remember my heart was just racing. Again, you're a journalist, but you're also a human being. And he nailed it. No problem, far away from the board. He went on to dive the rest of the dives. He had fallen from first to third by getting 0. He didn't even fall, just from that one dive, he only went to third place. He was that great.
Sounds like my chemistry grade, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. He was getting the 0, right? But anyway, so he comes back and makes it, and then the next day he wins the Olympic gold medal, and then he goes on to win the platform as well, and wins both gold medals.
That's a great story to wrap up, because it shows the value of being there. You have been there for journalism itself, especially for women journalists. You've always given back, sponsored scholarships. You're always available for lectures and podcasts like this. And I know you made sports writing a lot better because of your presence and your work. And I really want to say thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Well, Todd, thank you. What a delight to relive these stories, and to you as well. I always enjoyed seeing you, and I always enjoyed saying, okay, this is a triple toe loop, and this is a double axel.
Thanks for listening to Press Box Access. You can find us here with a new episode every other Wednesday. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and follow us on Apple Podcast or on your favorite podcast app. We'd love for you to review us. 5 stars would be nice. Follow us on social media. Drop us an email at pressboxaccess@gmail.com. And be sure to spread the word. Everyone is welcomed here. This has been a production of Evergreen Podcast. A special thank you to executive producers Michael D'Aloia and Gerardo Orlando, producer Sarah Wilgrube, and our audio engineer Dave Douglas. I'm your host, Todd Jones. It's closing time. Rock on.
I'm Bruce Martin, host of Pit Pass Indy. Each week, I go behind the scenes of the NTT IndyCar Series and introduce our listeners to the biggest stars of IndyCar, which features the Indianapolis 500 as its cornerstone event. The men and women that compete in IndyCar may be the bravest athletes in all of sport, as danger lurks around every corner. They are able to look danger in the eye without flinching. That is why the NTT IndyCar Series features the best racing on the planet. Join me every week as we talk to the stars of IndyCar, including the legends of the Indianapolis 500 on Pit Pass Indy from Evergreen Podcast.